When last we saw Cap, he was facing his darkest days on the page. Little did he or we know that within 3 years he would be facing his darkest days off the page too. The last chapter in this story was actually the last one to feature in the Daredevils comic, as once again Cap was on the move. Not that he had much choice, as the Daredevils actually folded with that issue, issue 11. Earlier that year, 1983, Marvel UK had launched the latest in its long line of anthology titles, as The Mighty World of Marvel hit the shelves. Yes, you heard right, The Mighty World of Marvel. It was the first series launched by the publisher in the UK in 1972, and eventually changed its name to Marvel Superheroes, issue 377 of which featured the debut of the Alan Davis era Captain Britain. That series was finally cancelled in May of 1983, before the very next month saw issue 1 of the all-new Mighty World of Marvel. I can't keep up. Cap joined the cast with issue 7, which, for the same reasons I gave in the last episode, I don't have. So we continue with the storyline courtesy of my hardback edition. Not for the first time in this series, when we left Brian Braddock, it was in the middle of a story. Unlike his run-in with the Highwayman and the Manipulator though, this time he was free of his enemies, albeit temporarily. Somewhat more permanent was the loss of his companions, as War Dog and the Special Executive decided to cut their losses and leave Captains Britain and UK, Saturnine and Betsy Braddock to face their uncertain futures alone. Actually, not entirely alone, they still have us. Things have moved on a bit since we last saw our heroes. Britain now has superhero internment camps, and an armed militia walks the streets enforcing law and order. This is because Betsy Braddock's vision and Linda McQuillan's worst nightmares have become a reality. It's all thanks to Member of Parliament Sir James Jaspers, who now, as a result of a landslide victory, is Prime Minister, and is beginning to be called by some Mad Jim. Issue 7's tale, The Candlelight Dialogues, does a great job of catching us up not only on the state of Britain, but also on how the myth of Captain Britain has grown amongst the oppressed population. This is done via a conversation between two inmates of one of those internment camps, one of whom looks perfectly normal, the other one clearly isn't. She looks like a nightmarish creature, but the only ill will she bears is against those beetles, the nickname given to those armed militia. Speaking of beetles, 3 of them have been sent by Vixen, in her guise as head of strike, to investigate the ruins of Braddock Manor. There they find the hole rent in the earth by Brian and his allies, and at the bottom of it they find what was buried. And they don't leave the site again. London is now very reminiscent of the Blitz, and we find our heroes hiding out in the basement of a deserted building. They are hiding out because Jim Jaspers sees any superhuman as a threat, so they know if they were found above ground, they would be caught and thrown into one of those internment camps. Times are very bleak for them indeed. Betsy can't even remember how long things have been this way. Has it been days or months? Brian and Saturnine have seen it before, back on the other Earth, the other reality. She says they can't let it happen again, and this time she won't abandon him. They will all be standing behind him, although he isn't convinced about Linda. Meanwhile, the Vixen, despite being in a position of power, is unhappy with how things are going. She thinks that with all the things that Jim Jaspers is doing, it's bound to attract the attention of the Americans, the Russians even, and they won't stand idly by and let it happen. So she visits him at Downing Street and discovers that he has gone full-on Mad Jim. The Vixen is no fool. She sees the danger and says to one of her henchmen, "I don't know what that is, but kill it. Quickly." But quickly, her henchmen find that they are very much out of their depth. And Vixen too is dealt with promptly, as Mad Jim turns her into her namesake. Just in case you forgot how good Alan Moore's scripting was, let's have a little reminder. as the sirens once more sound on the dark, grimy streets. And we are reminded it is England, not that you'd ever know. The sky is torn, the landscape is raped and raw. The night is curdled with nightmares, but it is still the country of Captain Britain. In case you weren't sure, we are now entering the end game, and it begins with Captain Britain's allies being discovered. Betsy sees it coming, but too late. Her boyfriend, who is punching way above his league, tries to buy them some time by holding off the beetles with his telekinetic powers. It doesn't work. Betsy and Alison, the other remaining psychic, are quickly caught, and Saturnine turns to Linda and says, "You've got to help." But Linda won't. She can't. Saturnine also runs off, but in fairness to her, on this occasion, what else could she have done? Roma and Merlin then tell us that Captain Britain was created for just this moment, this crisis. The Jim Jaspers that he faced before was a lesser version of this current one. But even then, Captain Britain was unsuccessful. He was defeated. He was killed. But if he isn't successful this time, it is not only the fate of this reality that is at stake, but of the entire omniverse. Meanwhile, Saturnine is sick and tired of Linda's attitude. She says again and again that she's a coward, that she let her world die, that she let her lover die. But she's pushed it too far. And that's exactly the reaction she wanted. And Cap? Well, the good news is he has found Mad Jim Jaspers. The bad news? He has found Mad Jim Jaspers. As we move on to issue 10, things aren't all entirely back to normal with Linda McQuillan. She's in her Captain UK uniform, but she still isn't entirely comfortable with it. But that's the least of our concerns, as Mad Jim Jaspers continues to crawl the muddy path to godhood. Cap says if he's even remotely sane, he can't do this. To which Jaspers replies, he's not, and he can. Another thing he can do is have fun with the good captain's mind, because he now finds himself back on that other alternate Earth with Saturnine and Jackdaw. But he is unsure, confused. He knows that things aren't right, even more so when all of his enemies attack at once. The Crazy Gang with their marbled eyes and fractured smiles. The junkyard thing with dead cars on its breath. This is so good. But Brian never gets to fight those foes because the fake Jackdaw mentions the fact that Brian's parents are dead. Something that Brian realises he never told Jackdaw. And just like that, reality shifts again. And we are reunited with the younger, smaller version of Brian Braddock. He is now married to Courtney Ross, and all of these bizarre adventures have happened in his head whilst he was in a coma after an accident occurred at Darkmoor. But of course, none of that is true. Alan Moore loves deconstructing his heroes, and Alan Davis loves putting them through the mill as well. So Cap doesn't really stand a chance, especially against someone with Mad Jim's powers. Of course, he does his best to fight, but really it's all rather pointless against someone with Mad Jim's power. In no time at all, it is Cap who is beaten down and lying exhausted in his tattered uniform. What a great image. But Cap isn't dead. He isn't defeated. He is a hero. And he musters all of his strength to clamber back onto his feet to continue the fight. After all, it's never over until it's over. You never know what might turn up next. I think I've talked enough about how good Alan Moore's writing is, so I'm going to skip the reintroduction of the Fury at the beginning of issue 11. Needless to say, it's brilliant. Also, needless to say, Brian isn't happy to see it, as he is soon thrown around like a rag doll. To help pass the time whilst this happens, Jim Jaspers creates this reality's version of the Crazy Gang. And he explains to them that he didn't just make them, but he made everything. He made the sky, he made the tiger and the lamb, the stars, the cockroaches, and then he sees the fury, and he has no recollection of making that. He approaches him in a typically Mad Jim manner and says he has a strange sense of déjà vu. As for the fury, it recognises him as Jaspers, but it also knows that it isn't his Jaspers. It isn't the man who created him to destroy all super beings except Mad Jim himself. And if it isn't that Mad Jim himself, then there's nothing stopping it from killing him. But Mad Jim doesn't die easily. Neither of them do. And they now embark on an all-powerful, mind-bending duel, whilst those still conscious look on in awe. Even Merlin, watching on from afar, cannot reconcile this approaching end of all creation, and his mind and his spirit leave him. The awesome battle continues in issue 12 as the two combatants fight their way through a variety of worlds and dimensions, all the time trying to out-adapt each other, until something occurs to the Fury. It reasons that Jaspers bends reality to his will. Therefore, if there was no reality, he would be defenceless. The Fury came from a place where there now is no reality, and he uses his ability to navigate dimensions to take the pair of them there, to unspace, where there is nothing. As we are told, the sculptor of reality has run out of clay, and it is now no difficult task at all for the Fury to kill Mad Jim Jaspers, and all it takes is the simple incineration of Jim's brain. It returns them back to where they'd come from and casually tosses aside Jim's dead body. It is victorious. It has defeated the man-god. But it wasn't easy. It needs to rest. It needs to assimilate new materials to repair itself. It needs time. It doesn't have it. After everything that has happened, Captain Britain, pushed on by his rage, has the upper hand. He hits, he tears, he pulls the thing apart. He knows he cannot let up, even for a moment. Saturnine and Captain UK watch on and see that the tide of battle can turn in an instant. And now it begins to choke the life from Brian Braddock. But Linda McQuillan has also been through so much, too much, and now she can't take any more. And now she fights with everything she's got. She's crying. Are they tears purely of frustration, of anger, or for those she has lost? Maybe even for herself. We are never told. We are told that she finds the thing's spine and rips it out. It starts to shriek, and for the first time in its existence, understands the concept of annihilation and gives up. It's some time later that Brian manages to bring her to her senses, and she stops tearing apart the thing's corpse. It is dead. They are victorious. But before Saturnine leaves, she wants a little memento. Just the tiniest bit of Jim's DNA. The whole saga draws to a close now, as our victorious heroes are whisked away to Otherworld, where they attend Merlin's funeral. There are many others there, such as the Black Knight, who says to Brian, "You've changed much since last we met." I'll say. Also the various alternate Captains Britain from across the Omniverse, including Commandant Englander. Not Hauptmann England, unfortunately. That would have been cool, wouldn't it? But I guess they're both from different alternate Nazi Britons. After the ceremony, Saturnine wastes no time in catching up with Mandragon, whom she gives a clear choice. Either resign as Emperor and reinstate her, or she will activate the DNA that she stole from Mad Jim Jaspers, there in Mandragon's home reality. what neither of them know is that Roma has already killed that DNA, so there really isn't a threat there at all. Nonetheless, the blackmail works, and Saturnine is once more omniversal Majestrix. With her in place, Roma tells Brian that he is now freed from servitude to Otherworld, and sends him and Linda McQuillan back to Earth. Indeed, back to Darkmoor. Both captains are now free to pursue their own destinies, and they part with a kiss. For some reason. Wow, what an epic. Brilliantly written, brilliantly illustrated. If you haven't already read it, if you don't own a copy, get one immediately. You won't regret it. Some things in comics are always true. Any popular character that dies won't stay dead. The decade in which you started reading comics is definitely when the medium was at its zenith, and Alan Moore's relationships with those he works with always turn sour. Unfortunately for Captain Britain and us, and even more so for Alan Davis, that was once again the case. It is very difficult to establish exactly what happened, as even Moore himself has given wildly differing versions of events over the years, including details that don't always fit in with the established Marvel timeline. What we do know is that Moore's work was getting a lot of attention from America, in particular DC Comics, and this led him to lose interest in his British work. Or was it that he was concerned that Cap was becoming too stereotypical a superhero? Moore has always been a champion of creators' rights, and maybe it was this that led him to, effectively, veto Marvel's plans to reprint his Captain Britain stories in America. Perhaps it was out of spite towards Jim Shooter, a man who he seemed to dislike before he had even worked with him. Whatever the reason, he did stop this epic storyline from being reprinted in the US at a time when it would have put Alan Davis on the map. Davis was understandably unhappy with this, but still friends with Moore, until it became clear that Moore wasn't going to back down, despite Davis's best efforts to persuade him otherwise. Thus, another relationship was spoiled by the master bridge burner. Whatever. It was messy, Moore left, a new writer was needed. The solution to Alan's departure may have been unexpected, but it was also entirely appropriate. Who else could be trusted with steering Brian Braddock in the right direction than one of the men responsible for his renaissance, Alan Davis himself? He would plot the next few issues that would actually lay a lot of groundwork for the post-Jaspers warp world, and set up the next year or so of stories. Other writers would help on scripting duties, but it was Alan that set up the England where reality was starting to heal itself, and the general populace's memories of Mad Jim's twisted work had, for the most part, been wiped clean. He also cemented into place Cap's most important and longest-serving supporting character. In issue 14... here we go again. Unfortunately, the mighty world of Marvel can be just as hard and pricey to get hold of as the Daredevils comics. So I'm resorting to reprints again. This time in the Captain Britain Autumn Special of 1992. A UK-only collection of the next 4 Captain Britain stories. Colourised, of course. The first page is really quite unusual because it's very full of images and word boxes, but nothing really happens. It's all very introspective, with Cap hanging out on the roof of a building, thinking about the things that have happened in the past and wondering what the future will hold. And I guess it sets up the new status quo because it mentions the fact that everything has basically returned to normal, reality is healing itself, and that everyone has forgotten the nightmare that they've been through. Way down below in an alleyway, we encounter a homeless drunk. His name is Sidney Crumb, and he is grumbling about his lot in life. As usual, he is drunk, but after hearing a sound, for the first time in a very long time, he is suddenly sober. But tonight is actually Sidney's lucky night, because Cap is on hand to deal with this diabolical creature. Hidden amongst the shadows, neither Cap nor we can make out the details of this thing, but it certainly is strong, as it knocks Cap aside. But no sooner is that done than the thing rushes away. After checking that Sidney is okay, Cap follows the creature into a nearby abandoned building. It's hiding out there. We get to see a little bit more of its face, and then, thanks to a flashback, we see that it is actually the creature from the Candlelight dialogues. Also, we see that it has a name, Megan. Now, if you're thinking, oh, that's a coincidence, Cap had a long-time girlfriend, in fact, actually married a woman called Megan, then you're wrong. It isn't a coincidence at all. This is that Megan. She changed a bit over the years. Seeing the figure follow her into the abandoned building, Megan swoops down to attack. There is a brief scuffle before she catches sight of who it is she's actually fighting. Captain Britain, a man that she idolised during the dark days of the Jaspers regime. Due to this, she skitters away back into the shadows, but Cap knows that she's still there, watching, and he wants to talk to her. Hearing a sound, he reaches out to grab what he thinks is Megan, but it turns out to be a lad. He and his sister are friends of Megan, and they visit that place to bring her the things she needs and also to help to keep her calm when the moon's full, because that is a period when she struggles to stay in control of her emotions. Megan, of course, is watching all this, but it doesn't look good. She thinks that Cap is hurting her friends, and she won't allow that. Thus, the fight resumes. The flying fists, and more so the flying bodies, destabilise the scaffolding that was set up within the building, and it comes crashing to the ground on top of the lad, killing him. Megan, seeing this, flies off in anguish, and Cap remains, feeling the burden of responsibility. A sombre ending to a short, dark, but really good, proper introduction of Megan. As much as I love the Fury storyline, I also really enjoyed this period in Cap's history, with his more down-to-earth adventures, and issue 15 really doubles down on this, as Brian visits a very suburban setting for an introspective tale. And then Betsy comes according to Braddock Manor in issue 16, where she meets its newest resident, Megan. And then, well, you can probably guess what happens, can't you? Captain Britain, once again, was moving on. I know, it's becoming beyond a joke, isn't it? But once again, he was leaving a failing title, as there was only one more issue of the Mighty World of Marvel released after he left it. And where did he end up? Well, the wheel had turned full circle. The character that had started out in his very own self-titled comic had ended up once more in his very own self-titled comic, in issue 1 of Captain Britain. Finally, it isn't a reprint, I hear you cry. There would be a few differences this time though. Unlike the original Captain Britain series, this one would feature no colour content whatsoever. Also, in keeping with Marvel UK's recent strategy, it would be released on a monthly basis, not weekly. There was one further monumental difference. This would be the first Marvel UK series that would be available in the USA. Because of that, this first issue's story would act as a recap for those readers discovering the character for the first time outside of brief guest appearances. Through the twin lenses of Chief Inspector Di Thomas delivering a briefing to his superiors, and Brian and Betsy reminiscing about old times, we are told all about Brian Braddock's personal history, the attack on Darkmoor, Cap's trip to Otherworld with the Black Knight, and, of course, the Jaspers warp storyline. Showing us along the way Brian taking up the amulet, various enemies, and his change from version 1 to version 2 of Captain Britain. Over the next couple of issues, we see the Crazy Gang learning how to supervillain, along with the return of the Vixen and Slaymaster, and the introduction of the TechNet, and the new organisation taking over from Strike, the RCX. Issue 4 has a great standalone story, and then the Captain wanders from adventure to adventure, including our first genuine alternate Brian Braddock, along with an alternate Saturnine. Cap and Megan begin to connect at the end of issue 7, although, as we all know, she isn't the Megan that we're all familiar with. However, that all begins to change with issue 8. We've got to check this one out, haven't we? The RCX are approaching Braddock Manor along with Linda McQuillan. They persuaded her to help them out in the previous issue, and they're hoping that her presence will help to get Brian on side as well. They explain that the Jaspers warp let a lot of weirdness out of the box, and now they need help to get things back on track. Megan is listening outside the window, but she is soon distracted by some kind of call coming from the RCX's van. Whilst she flies off to investigate that, we are treated to a flashback of her origin. She was born into a traveller community, but it wasn't long after she was born that her parents saw that there was something very peculiar about their child, especially when she sprouted fur as the weather got cold. Despite her parents' best efforts, her uniqueness couldn't be hidden away, and her community isolated her, her only means of escape being via the exciting worlds she discovered via the television. And if that wasn't bad enough, after Mad Jim came to power, she was soon locked up. That reinforced her instinctive horror of confinement, which is now brought to the fore, as she discovers what it was in the van that was calling out to her. They are strange, very strange, but that doesn't seem to her to be a good reason to lock them up. So she does what she feels is right, and they are free. Meanwhile, negotiations between Brian and the RCX aren't going well because he just doesn't trust them. And why do they want him to join them? I'm not entirely sure. There's lots talked about here. Lots of talk about a crisis as a result of the Jaspers warp. Something about the population, something about hatred, principles, freedom, all that kind of thing. But it isn't entirely clear what the issue is and how Brian is going to specifically help them. Linda says, sometimes we must fight fire with fire. We have a chance to prevent persecution and suffering. Principles must be sacrificed. Why? For what threat? Nothing materialises from this in future issues either. The RCX are still around and basically making a bid for some kind of power. But again, what is this threat? What is going wrong in Britain, in society, that they need Brian's help? He still says no. And they say, well, in that case, you're going to have to let us use your computer, or else we'll use force to take it from you. He says, how can you use force against me? And Linda tells him about the creatures in the back of the van, the dregs of the Jaspers warp, the warpies, or as the RCX has called them, the cherubim. She says they're children, but they look powerful. Before they can carry out their threat, they are told that somebody has let the warpies out, and the results aren't good. Some of the cherubim have the ability to conjure up basically a hurricane, and they have done just that. And the other weirdly powered cherubim are heading directly for the manor. Megan is witnessing what she has unleashed, and she quickly flies into the hurricane in an attempt to put an end to it. But as she does so, something very strange happens. Within the hurricane, it is as if the wind stretches her, peels her skin from her. And we are given another flashback, not to her childhood this time, but to a time much more recent, when the psychic Alison was telling Megan that she was beautiful, like an iridescent butterfly. This is not something that Megan has ever been told before, but Alison says her aura, her potential is what is beautiful. She says she doesn't have to appear as she does. The way she looks is not her natural appearance. She was like soft clay, moulded by the fear and superstition of her people. When Megan says that she doesn't understand, Alison just says, perhaps not now, but when she does, the caterpillar will become a butterfly. And now, in the heart of that maelstrom, the metamorphosis has happened, and the inner beauty of Megan is finally revealed. Well, that's all well and good, but there is still a battle raging down below, and the Braddock twins and Captain UK are in the thick of it. And what a battle it is too, thanks to the cherubim's unusual powers. Whether it be Brian struggling against Quill with his razor-sharp talons, Linda battling the creature called Fern that isn't really human at all, or Betsy facing the electric Siamese twins known as AC/DC. Fortunately for her, Captain UK decides to launch Fern in their direction, taking all three of them out at once. And then the individual called Lump tries to conjure up an image of our hero's worst fears, which turns out not to be a good idea, as it just spurs them on more than ever before. Whilst all this is going on, the RCX are trying to persuade Braddock Manor's holographic butler, Jeeves, that actually siding with them could be rather advantageous. He, it seems, agrees. The battle outside is nearly over. There's just one thing to deal with, and that is that hurricane. Although that doesn't last, as all of a sudden, the 5 cherubim who created it are knocked out of the sky. All is now quiet once more, but nobody recognises this angelic form that brought an end to the hurricane. Nobody except Alison, that is, who instantly recognises the beautiful creature, Megan. The RCX recognise her power and instantly want to control or eliminate her, neither of which Brian is going to allow. She pleads with Brian not to let them take her away or hurt her, something he is happy to agree to, as he reassures her that no one can hurt her now. Most of the cherubim have now been rounded up, although a few of them are still missing. But what is clear is that there is no way that Brian is going to help the RCX. So they fall back on plan B, Betsy Braddock. They hope that she will agree to lodging the young warpy children in Braddock Manor. And Betsy, being infinitely more compassionate than her brother, they are right. She agrees. Not only do the RCX now not need Brian Braddock, but they actively want him out of the picture. Jeeves thinks he knows how this can be achieved. Firstly, he knows that the often grumpy Brian Braddock will soon get sick and tired of sharing his home with the warpy children. And indeed, it does drive him to drink, something that Brian has never been shy to do. Secondly, he feeds the RCX some information that they act on, and before you know it, there's a news broadcast that will change the course of both Brian and Megan's lives. It seems that Brian's brother, Jamie, has been kidnapped whilst in Africa. No sooner have they heard this news than the phone rings, and on the other end is Jamie Braddock. But he isn't alone. He sounds terrified out of his skin, and who could blame him? Those holding him hostage don't look like the most friendly of souls. So due to Jeeves and the RCX's machinations, Brian is diverted away from Braddock Manor and to Africa in issue 10. Although when he learns that his brother Jamie is involved in the modern slave trade, he leaves him in the hands of his torturer. I do hope that decision doesn't come back to bite him. He and Megan then begin a brief world tour in issue 11, which also sees the beginning of the cherubim in their own backup strip, written and drawn by Mike Collins. Issue 12 is interesting because we see how most of the TechNet ended up joining the Special Executive, even though we saw them first. Time travel. The issue ends with Brian returning home to see 2 Captains Britain, as Betsy has fully aligned herself with Linda and the RCX. This does not please Brian, and he quits, turning his back on the life of a superhero. What happens next? Things turn brutal. How brutal? Well, the very first image we get is of Betsy being punched in the face. She then proceeds to be beaten by an as yet unseen assailant, whilst intercut with that are flashbacks showing us how we got to where we are. And as we leave her flat on her back, we see that she didn't want to be Captain Britain in the first place. The RCX want to be associated with Captain Britain to enhance their reputation and to curry favour with the British Prime Minister. As we know, Brian isn't going to agree to that. Well, that's okay, because maybe they can create a new Captain Britain. Betsy suggests Linda for the role, which makes a lot of sense. But Linda isn't interested. She doesn't want to continue down that path, although she does say that she'll hang around for a few months and work with Betsy to give her the benefit of her experience. The RCX also warn her that the protection of the warpy children, the cherubim, could be at stake if they can't get the government on their side. And so, begrudgingly, Betsy agrees to be the new Captain Britain. They already have a new uniform for her, and they even have a new one for Linda. And soon enough, the two new partners take to the skies. As well as giving her the ability to fly, the suit just makes her feel powerful. And we see that the two of them make a successful crime-fighting team. They feature on news reports. The RCX are very happy with how things are going, but then we are told after a few months, Linda is moving on and is leaving Betsy to it. Then the fateful day arrives when Betsy is told that the Vixen has kidnapped a couple of RCX agents along with a truckload of warpies. Unless the new Captain Britain meets the Vixen at a construction site beside the River Thames, she will kill all the hostages. Clearly, Betsy is going to be walking into a trap, but that's the life of a superhero. She arrives at the construction site, and the Vixen is there, but she isn't alone. With her is a figure from Betsy's past, a killer of Betsy's former colleagues in Strike's Psi Division, Slaymaster. He now has his own ability-enhancing costume, but Betsy says she doesn't care because now she has real power and she's going to enjoy using it on him. It doesn't start out too badly, but I'm afraid that doesn't last. Remember that beating that Betsy was suffering? Yeah, well, consider yourselves up to date, because it is Slaymaster, cheered on by the Vixen, who is pummeling the new Captain Britain to within an inch of her life. But the beating isn't the worst of it, because the battle ends with him tearing her eyes out. Those of you who are familiar with Psylocke having mechanical replacement eyes, that is the moment when she lost her own. Meanwhile, life for Brian couldn't be more different. It's been months since he wore the Captain Britain costume, and he and Meghan are living a simple, happy life in a lighthouse, yes, that lighthouse, off the coast of Scotland. There have been other developments. For example, Brian has learnt that he can fly without the costume. He theorises that the uniform wasn't an amplifier after all. It was more like a crutch that stopped him from developing his full abilities. But his musings are interrupted by a painful psychic distress call. Betsy needs him, and despite their recent differences, he will be there for her. Back beside the Thames, Betsy is now nothing more than a limp rag doll. Both the Vixen and Slaymaster are gloating over their victory, although Slaymaster says he wishes that he could take on the original Captain Britain. Well, be careful what you wish for, because suddenly there is a screaming sound in the air, like a diving jet plane. And then this is how you make an entrance. Tell me that wasn't satisfying. In the brief pause that Brian has bought, he sees his sister. Devastated, he asks Slaymaster why he did what he did. And Slaymaster, rather stupidly, says that she was not a worthy foe. She deserved no better. Not only was that an unwise thing to say, but he also points out how futile it is of Brian to face him without his amplifier costume. Unfortunately for Slaymaster, he's about to find out that Brian's theory about the costume was correct. The Vixen's no fool. She sees the way things are going and quickly leaves the scene. As for Brian, he just doesn't hold back. That is, until he has Slaymaster completely at his mercy. Slaymaster knows that the two of them are very different people, and he says to Brian, "Fool, you have not the strength to kill." Yeah, he did that. If Slaymaster had read Captain Britain's earlier adventures, he would have known he was happy to kill. Bloody hell. And Brian isn't finished yet, because later on, the front door of Braddock Manor explodes off of its hinges. He is furious with the RCX. He says that they sent Betsy out to die whilst they hid in the manor. But it seems we didn't know everything that had happened, because one of the RCX, Gabriel, had actually tried to talk Betsy out of going to meet the Vixen. But Betsy insisted, because she was trying to shame Brian into coming out of retirement. As a result, Brian agrees not to pound Gabriel into a hamburger, although the same couldn't be said of his colleague. Betsy is going to remain in the manor whilst she recuperates, but Brian still wants nothing to do with the RCX, so he isn't hanging around. He's going to return to the lighthouse. Once there, he explains to Megan that his reaction to Betsy being in trouble caught him off guard, caught him by surprise. He thought he'd left those kind of emotions in the past, but he was wrong. He can't hide from his responsibility, because he is Captain Britain. And although this chapter is over, the rest of the comic is of real interest to a Captain Britain fan. For a start, there's a reprint of when Captain Britain met the Black Knight during the Otherworld saga. And then, as well as the Cherubim's own comic strip, we have a text story about one of the alternate Captain Britons, Captain Grand-Bretagne, from a reality where Napoleon wasn't defeated, and indeed conquered Britain. They love text stories in this series, and this one was actually by a young Grant Morrison. Anyway, enough of that issue, as interesting and as dramatic as it was. Let's move on to the next chapter. It's Christmas Eve, and Captain Britain and Megan are cuddled up in front of the fire, having the cosiest of nights. That is, until a knock at the door heralds the return of an old familiar face. It's Di Thomas. He says he's flattered that Brian, who he now reveals he knows is Captain Britain, remembers him. He says it's been a long time. I'll say these two haven't crossed paths since the days of Super Spider-Man. They've both changed a bit since then. Di says that he's had to swallow his pride and come to Brian for help because there have been some particularly gruesome murders in Glasgow. The police think that it's down to gangland activity, but the murders happen so quickly and are so brutal that the police just can't deal with them. He is hoping that Brian will agree to work undercover, pretending to be some kind of new up-and-coming gangland boss, and that will flush the perpetrators out into the open. There's a particularly good panel on this page, which serves as a real study in body language. Look at that, it's brilliant. Di is open, asking for help. Megan is horrified by what she's heard, and Brian, well, you can see what he thinks about Di appearing on his doorstep. But Di is desperate. He says he has nowhere else to go, and he pleads with Brian to help him. Meanwhile, Linda McQuillan is at Darkmoor, where she meets up with Roma. Roma explains that because Linda isn't on the correct Earth, it's causing problems. She is an anomaly, and that needs to be corrected. And she takes her away to Otherworld. Brian has sorted out a disguise. It's not ideal though. I don't think the Kiss Me Quick hat helps. When it comes to disguises, Megan has a distinct advantage. And using her shape-shifting power, she quickly cycles through a few different looks. So yes, they have agreed to help out Di. Oh, in case you're wondering how Betsy's getting on, she's okay. She's at Braddock Manor, recovering quite well actually, whilst looking after the warpie children. By Boxing Day, Glasgow's two newest would-be gangsters are making an impression on the local scene. I don't know what Brian's wearing. It's like he's taken Wonder Man's safari jacket to the next level. After making an impression on those gangland bosses, they repeat the performance around the city. They also make it known that they are hiding out in an abattoir. Then, whilst waiting there for the local gangs to respond to their apparent threat, the relationship between Brian and Di seems to thaw. It helps that Di is as against the RCX as Brian is. He also explains that the press distorted his campaign against superhumans, making it sound unreasonable, whilst Brian explains that he knows how easily innocent people can be caught up, hurt, even lose their lives in the battle between good and evil superhumans. But he does point out that he never asked for the power or the responsibility. He says the only difference between him and Di are that his mistakes are in proportion to his powers. And if he's lucky, so are his successes. before Di says that their plan has worked and apparently an assassin known as Shoulders McGill is on his way to kill them. On Otherworld, Roma has a proposition for Linda. She points out that Linda is a hero without a world, but there is a world without a hero. The world that was home to the now dead Captain Briton, the evil Cap. She suggests that Linda take up the role on that world of its protector. Linda isn't too sure, but Roma has a sign of her appreciation, her gratitude. She asks Linda to think back to the moment her husband was killed at the hands of the Fury. It's not particularly a memory that she wants to revisit, but she explains the Fury came after them. It lunged at her husband, but he disappeared. And after a brief moment of confusion, the Fury continued with his slaughter. But didn't the Fury kill her husband? Yeah, it did. But Roma has now reached back through time. She has made an adjustment, and it turns out her husband survived. Meanwhile, Di has come across some drunk who's found his way into the abattoir, and he tries to move him on. But this is no ordinary drunk. This is Shoulders McGill. But he isn't the killer. He just carries the killer with him in a case. And opening the case, the real killer, who appears to be a warpie, emerges. It's quick, very quick, but not quick enough. Cap tells Di to get himself and Shoulders out of the building, whilst he and Megan deal with this creature. We then get a brilliant page. Now, what I haven't told you is that this is New Year's Eve, and the bells are about to chime midnight. And for each peal of the bell, we get an image of Cap and Megan, or the dripping carcasses in the abattoir. The warpie itself, clashes between the warpie and our heroes, and the very last one shows the warpie closing in on them, going in for the kill. But that great page is followed by a great single panel, as Cap spectacularly dispatches the beast. So the mystery of the brutal Glasgow murders is solved, quite decisively in fact. And Di and Brian are now reconciled. But there's more going on than just that. We see Linda and her husband victorious against the fascistic forces of the alternate Saturnine. Betsy is recuperating in the Swiss Alps. Mastermind has asserted his control over the RCX at Braddock Manor. And Captain Britain and Megan are back in the lighthouse for the new year. It feels like everything has been neatly tied up, doesn't it? There's a reason for that. Yes, because it's that time again. Time for Cap's latest series to come to an end. Issue 14 would be the last issue in this series. But as you know by now, Captain Britain always has somewhere else to move on to. This time, things were different. Disappointing sales had once more proved to be the character's undoing, but this time there was nowhere else to go. He would not be moving into another anthology title. A new creative team would not take up the challenge. His time as a comic book star had come to an end. Thinking back to his initial creation in 1976, it was an ambitious plan from a publishing arm that had until that point relied on reprint material. A publishing arm that seemed to forever be trying to work out how to fit Marvel's square peg into the British comic market's round hole. For 10 years, the character had embarked on a variety of adventures, been reinvented and even crossed genres, all whilst having a sprinkling of comicdom's greatest talent work on him. It was ambitious, it was to be admired, but ultimately it failed. Oh, Cap. I guess that's that. It was good while it lasted. What's this? Is this at last the end for Captain Britain? Never? Captain USA? Paying a visit? Jim Shooter? Chris Claremont? Planning to feature the Captain in next year's X-Men annual? Never the end? By the hoary hosts of Hoggoth!